good evening. It's March 26th, 2026, and welcome to an episode of Coffee and Donuts with Beau Stringer. As you already know, I enjoy the Substack platform. It seems pretty good. They allow me to control over what shows up on my feed anyways, and on that platform, we see the likes of Carmen Imes, we talk about Savannah Locke, and tonight, Beau Stringer. He recently made a blog post, and I wanted to share it with you. The post didn't have a title, so I had to come up with one for the episode. I hope it does help. It's How Do We Read, See, View Jesus in the Gospels? Because it brought up several things to ponder, and I needed to get my coffee and donuts at the ready to talk about them, and maybe even consider stretching ideas. There are links in the description to this article and to his page on his Substack website, and I highly encourage you to take a look at those. There's so much more to explore. So let's get started with Coffee and Donuts with Beau Stringer and how do we read, see, view Jesus in the Gospels on the Dusty Feet. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you are not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. TheDustyFeet.com. That's our primary place to find everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. It's designed around the written and spoken text. It's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook at The Dusty Feet. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. 4. And as always, you're welcome to send an email to bob@thedustyfeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation. Belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. Oh, and before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, please click that subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that is when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So how do we read, see, view Jesus in the Gospels? I've heard many different, how do I put this? Comments, ways that people want to view, see Jesus in the Gospels. But let's be fair. The only stuff we really have about him is only in those 4 books. So little, really. And all of them are from different people, different backgrounds, agendas, even different personal contact, It's a pretty safe assumption that 3 of them probably had direct contact with Jesus, as in Matthew, John, Mark, but we don't have any direct evidence that Luke was actually seen or actually followed Jesus in person. Luke's account, it's an amalgam of, today what we would call them interviews, the way when you go to talk to somebody so that you can then put their story in your book. Because Luke had gathered all the stories, all the information, things he was bringing, things that he felt he needed to put together, and he did that to share with Thaddeus. And then, by extension, for us, lucky, it gets to us. Kind of like what he did. But I get all of that. So now we can ask questions. And one of them is, what Beau's talking about. How do we see Jesus in these Gospels? And really, when I say that, I'm not talking about the physical visage, the picture of him, because I'm not sure I agree with most prevalent artwork, but it's more about his character. And inside of that, how we today, because that's probably changed throughout history. So right now, we're just going to speak for ourselves with our hands in the air. And because in today, we put stickers on things, we put labels on things, at least minor descriptors of how we see somebody. Because we have nice words like loving, caring, friendly. We have other terms like insightful, intense, generous. And we have words like heretic, rebel, and one who pushes the boundaries. Personally, I'm not against any of those titles because each needs to be viewed in the context of the person and how you'd be describing them to someone. And Beau Stringer, well, he addresses his idea on his blog post. So I want to read it to you first so you get the full context. It's important. We kind of like that here on the Dusty Feet. And then we'll talk about maybe some other stretching thoughts, maybe even a few different word choices that might give us another way to look at Jesus. So here's his blog post, and hopefully it'll be worth discussion. So there's a pattern in the Gospels that gets overlooked because we've been trained to read Jesus as a law keeper or a lawbreaker. The truth is, he's neither. He's a law reinterpreter. And the lens he consistently uses is relationship over regulation. When the Pharisees confront him about picking grain on the Sabbath, Jesus doesn't argue that the law is wrong. He points to David eating the showbread, that bread reserved for priests, and says essentially, human need trumped ritual purity then, and it does now too. The rational law asks, what does the rule say? The relational law asks, what does love require? Jesus heals on the Sabbath, repeatedly, most provocatively, because he understands what Torah is for, right? The Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for Sabbath. And that is a profound reorientation of what law is supposed to be. The same logic runs through the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, but I say to you. He's deepening its past behavior into motive, or its compliance into character. The rational law, well, that can be satisfied by not murdering someone. The relational law asks whether you're dehumanized them in your heart. This is why Jesus could summarize the entire Torah in 2 commands. Love God, love neighbor. And say everything else hangs on those 2. If your rule keeping produces contempt, you've missed the point. If your doctrinal precision produces exclusion, and you've missed the point. If your Sabbath observance makes you unable to help someone in front of you, you've missed the point. Jesus came to show us what a human being looks like when love is the organizing principle of every choice. That's the relational law, and it's more demanding than anything the Pharisees ever required. That's from Beau Stringer on Substack. So this will not surprise you because I want to put another thought out for us to consider. Let's make a small word change. I'm going to see how it gives us some additional ways to look at what Beau is talking about. Because I very much love what he said. I'm not looking to twist it, what he said in any way, shape, or form, so please understand that up front. What I would like to do is give us a few more things to ponder, to remember, and to have your coffee and donuts at hand while we do. So part of what draws me is the baggage we bring when we talk about certain things. In this particular case, it's about law, right? So I'd like us maybe to consider replacing law with Torah, because maybe when we talk about it in the context of using the word Torah, we'll be able to see how maybe these instructions then, these guidelines, right, then these words of wisdom that God is sharing with his children, that helps keep the relationship between himself, as in God, and others, Well, that's just to love and respect them. These words are given, they're ways to show how that's lived, how that's expressed, how it's engaged with in the community and everywhere around them. Because maybe if you think of it that way, maybe it'll shift because that's not how I view laws. At least the baggage that I bring. That's not how I view laws. That's not what I think about when I think about laws. But it is what I think about when I think about Torah. And I think we see in the gospel accounts that they, the Pharisees, they seem to be confronting him on a lot of things. But two big ones here. And one's that he was confronting them about his violation of Torah. And the other, well, that was the violation of their traditions. And I think the big confusing point for them, but I want to be careful because we often carry mirrors in our hands here. There was a point at which they had elevated their traditions to be equal to and or more important than Torah itself. And I think in that, as Beau said, they lost the plot on the relational purpose, the intended design of Torah. How does this sound? There's a pattern in the Gospels that gets overlooked because we've been trained to read Jesus as either a Torah keeper or a Torah breaker. The truth is, he's neither. He is a Torah reinterpreter. And the lens he consistently uses is relationship to show the purpose in that regulation, that guidance, that instruction. So see, it's a few different words. And maybe it'll cause some baggage to be dropped. I expect possibly some others are going to be picked up. But some of it is wrapped around how we view the terms that he used. Rational law, relational law. It's an interesting thought to me. So I want to make a little left turn here. But maybe that will going to help us support what we're going to talk about as we continue this. Because I was in a discussion with some guys about Judaism, and I obviously had to talk about Torah and its purpose. And as I did put it out there, I said that I thought Torah was like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the base law structure. All of it's wrapped into one. And I think I'll kind of stick by that, right? Yet when I look at Torah as law structure, I tend to believe that God's framework is exactly what Beau's talking about. And that is, it's designed as relational law. Although I personally giggle at the point whether I ever think of relationship in terms of law terminology. That's why I'm not a big fan of the word with relationship and law. But in Torah, we see those instructions, right? They're wrapped around the importance of relationships, both with God and with everyone else. And then how do we do that? In a healthy, safe, God-focused environment. Because God is setting up his land, right? That's his environment, his space. Remember, this is what he promised to that single man, Abraham, hundreds of years before. And he didn't have Torah. But I liked where Beau put this. He said, the relational law asks, what does love require? Again, I tend to lean towards instruction, guidance, wisdom. So what would relational instruction, relational guidance, relational wisdom, and its aspect in love require? Especially the relational context. Because I like that versus law. So maybe with those shifts in words, it might help us maybe look at things from a slightly different perspective. Because one of the things that really does hit me at the core is when we're talking about these phrases, that when we're talking about Jesus, we're calling him a law keeper or a lawbreaker or a Torah keeper or a Torah breaker. But if he's really intent on Torah being put away, then his real statement shouldn't have been, why you're bringing this up to me. It would be, why you bring this up to me? None of this matters. So I really don't care what you have to say about that. But that's not what he does. And it is how he lives. Because yes, the Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for Sabbath. And I love that, because it draws even more questions on our importance of God's Sabbath. However, it's for an entirely different discussion. But I think we're both going here, and I'm agreeing with him that they had, when I say they, I just want us to be careful, because just like we do in our own churches, holding a mirror in hand, the churches have ways of doing things, and in those ways of doing things, they tell you this is how it's supposed to be done to be a Christian. Some denominations, they'll even go so far as to say, if you're not doing it our way, then, well, you're not really a Christian. That might lean towards, some would say, that regulatory side. But Beau uses the term rational law. I hear that. I just want us to be careful that we don't lump things into groups and then we miss some of the value of these other elements in those instructions, in that guidance, in that wisdom, right? Because Jesus, throughout his ministry, he encouraged them to stay the course of Torah. When he healed someone, they needed to go to the priest to be examined, to be declared clean, especially a leper. It was now safe to re-enter society because there was enough care to ensure that the other people, that they're kept safe. And so Jesus said, hey, go to the priest, do what needs to be done, and then you're back in society, you're back in community. So do you call what they needed to do? In that, there was a mikvah, right? Some might call it baptism, because I think then it fits here. It's an important element in this instruction, this law, to bring them back into community. It's part of the instruction. Everybody's taken care of in love. And yes, you could say that's rational law. But in truth, I do think it's more like what Beau says. That is relational law. So maybe when we look at these points in Torah, we view them not as must-dos or must-don'ts, but as maybe looking at some as, why does this help the community and my relationship with God? And then how do we all benefit from it? Great questions to ask while you're going through them. I really smiled when I read one of the points that Beau made, because I've actually said it several times here on the Dusty Feet, almost verbatim, right? This is why Jesus could summarize the entire Torah in 2 commands. Love God, love your neighbor. Everything else hangs on these. I've said this many times, but it looks like a mobile. There's a lot more hanging on. It's not just those 2 parts. Because you know me. I believe the Torah instructions, they still have value. They are to be considered, right? And I view them, like Beau's talking about, from the relational law perspective of it. Because I enjoyed one of his other wrap-up points. If your rule-keeping produces contempt, you've missed the point. If your doctrine precision produces exclusion, yeah, you've missed the point. And if your Sabbath observance makes you unable to help someone right in front of you, yeah, you've missed the point. And the last point that Beau made, I want to stretch a little. Not meaning to be disrespectful by any way, shape, or form, but again, like I said, some word choices make us possibly take a slightly different perspective. Put it this way. Jesus came to show us what a human being looks like when Torah love is the organizing principle for every choice. It's that Torah love, that relational Torah. Well, that's more demanding than the Pharisees ever required. Because if Jesus meant to do away with Torah, then all of his analogies, all of the pointing to Passover and the atonement and that, well, they really wouldn't have any bearing, would they? But instead, it's wrapped all around those. It continues to be wrapped around that. And I agree. Jesus went further than any Pharisees would ever consider doing. And yet we all, including those Pharisees, we all get to experience the love, the commitment of Jesus to obey his Father, his words, his ways, the sacrifice. And that allows us to enjoy a brave new world beyond the second death. And then we get to see who can be with us as we go along that next journey. So I highly recommend that you take the opportunity to get on Substack platform. Like I said, I like the way you can narrow the feed so I can look at what I think might be helpful, not that distracting, buzzing, clanging, banging noise that continues to go on in our world today. But inside that, I still think there's people worth listening to include Carmen Imes, Savannah Locke, Beau Stringer, amongst others, some of whom I hope we'll probably get to enjoy at other Coffee and Donuts. Because it's an interesting and yet upside down perspective that I tend to have at times, I know, is that I don't see Jesus as a Torah ender. Actually, I don't see Jesus as a rule breaker. I do see Jesus as a promise keeper. I see Jesus as a Torah follower. He did what his Father said. I see Jesus as obedient to his Father. Yet to be fair, I do see Jesus as a tradition challenger. Because suppose someone has the viewpoint that their tradition is the way it's supposed to be. So then, yeah, I'd be a tradition breaker to those Pharisees in that time, in that place. He was branded that. He might be branded a heretic because he didn't see it their way. But of course, I think today, and most likely in traditional churchianity circles, I might also be labeled a heretic for not seeing it along traditional lines. But I do hope that in my eulogy, right, that it says he tried to be a relational Torah follower. And that, as Beau puts it, puts relationship at the forefront. And that relationship with God and others, well then yes, that is harder than any tradition, any Pharisee, or any preacher that they'll ever express. So thank you for with us tonight for a hopefully worthwhile discussion amongst ourselves about how do we read, see, view Jesus in the Gospels. And then, where do we go from here on the Dusty Feet?